Nobody notices the man pushing the mop. Not the analysts who spill their cold brew and keep walking. Not the executives who hold meetings in glass rooms and never glance at the hallway beyond the pane. Not the security guards who nod at the camera feeds and never at the human beings beneath them. Marcus Reed had learned this truth, the way a soldier learns terrain slowly, completely, and with a precision that never left him. He had been invisible before, in far more dangerous places than a corporate lobby, on the 42nd floor of a glass tower in downtown Chicago. And invisibility had kept him alive then. Now, at 42, with a mop handle in his hand and a city sleeping outside the windows, invisibility was simply the life he had chosen. What nobody in Heart Technologies understood, what nobody had even thought to ask, was that the quiet black man who arrived each night at 10 o'clock and left before the first shift managers showed up had once been the kind of person governments called when all other options had failed. Nobody knew. And for a long time, that had been exactly the way Marcus Reed wanted it. He was 6 feet 2 inches and built the way time and discipline build a man, not for vanity, but for function. His shoulders carried the quiet weight of someone who had spent years carrying things heavier than equipment. His face was still and composed in a way that read as indifference to people who did not know the difference between a man who felt nothing and a man who had trained himself not to show everything. His hands, wrapped around a mop or a cleaning cart or a trash liner, were the hands of someone who had assembled weapons in near total darkness, who had rappelled down rock faces in temperatures cold enough to kill, who had applied pressure to wounds on men he loved while calling in coordinates through a burst radio. But none of that showed. None of that surfaced. The nighttime floors of Heart Technologies gleamed under his effort, and the day crew walked across them without a second thought. And that was the agreement Marcus had made with himself when he took the job 14 months ago. The agreement was simple. Do the work, keep the head down, take the check home, and remember that the man he used to be was a person the world no longer needed to know about. His colleagues on the night cleaning crew were decent people. A Haitian woman named Bernadette, who played gospel music through one earbud while she worked, and had a directness of spirit that reminded Marcus of the chaplains he had respected. A heavyset man named George, who was working toward a plumbing license and liked to talk about pipe fittings with the genuine enthusiasm of someone who has found his calling late, and 2 younger men, early 20s, who called Marcus old head when they thought he couldn't hear, and spent most of their shift doing as little as possible. Marcus did not correct them. He did not explain himself to them. He simply worked his section, completed his checklist, and moved through the building with the kind of quiet efficiency that made supervisors write glowing reports they never needed to explain. He was a model employee because model employees are not scrutinized. He understood that with the same clarity, he understood everything else. The 42nd floor was his. The executive level. The kind of floor where the carpet was different, thicker, darker, more expensive, and where the conference rooms had names instead of numbers, and the plants were real and tended by someone other than whoever cleaned the floor. Sophia Hart's office was in the northeast corner, and it had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the lake, and on clear nights, Marcus could see the reflection of city lights scattered across the water like something spilled and beautiful. He had noticed it 3 weeks into the job and had not let himself think about it much since. That was how he managed most things. Notice, assess, file. Don't linger. Lingering was how a man ended up wanting things he had decided not to want anymore. Sophia Hart was 38 years old and ran a technology company worth $4.6 billion with the kind of sustained, undistracted focus that most people describe when they talk about someone who has never had the luxury of failing and surviving it. She had built Hart Technologies from a consulting startup she launched at 26 into one of the most influential enterprise software companies in the country. And she had done it without a co-founder, without inherited wealth, and without softening herself for rooms that expected her to be decorative. She was direct and precise. She made decisions faster than her teams expected and better than her board anticipated, and she was currently in the middle of negotiating the largest acquisition in the company's history, a merger with a European firm called Vantara Systems that would double Hart Technologies' market reach and, if it closed, cement her position as one of the most powerful women in American technology. Her calendar had no empty days. She slept less than she should have, and drank more coffee than was wise, and stayed in the office long past the point when her assistant had stopped pretending to still be busy. The first time she spoke directly to Marcus was on a Tuesday in late October. He had come around the corner with his cart and found a scatter of documents on the hallway floor outside the elevator bank printed briefing pages, numbered and marked with the kind of classification stamps that corporate lawyers use when they want to make clear that information is sensitive. A gust from an opening door had clearly caught them mid-transfer. He crouched, gathered them. In order he noticed the order instinctively, the numbering, the logical sequence, and stood, as Sophia came around the corner, at a near run, her phone in one hand and a leather portfolio in the other, her expression carrying the specific strain of someone who has already done 12 hours of high-stakes work and is being asked to do 3 more. She stopped when she saw him holding the pages. There was a half-second where her eyes measured him not with suspicion, exactly, but with the honest assessment of a person who sizes up situations quickly and has learned to trust that reflex. Then she stepped forward and took the papers, and she said, "Thank you. I mean that." Not the absent half-phrase that people drop when they want to be polite without spending energy on it. She looked at him when she said it. That distinction was not lost on Marcus. It was the kind of small thing he had learned to notice. Because small things, in his experience, were where character actually lived. He said, "Of course, ma'am," and she nodded and moved on, and that was the end of it. But as he pushed his cart back toward the service corridor, Marcus glanced out toward the building's south exit and saw the dark sedan that had been parked on the same block for the 3rd consecutive night shift. It was a different vehicle, each time a quality that amateurs called variety and professionals called pattern. He watched it for 4 seconds, then turned away and continued his route. He did not tell himself it was probably nothing. He had stopped saying that to himself a long time ago. The emails started 3 weeks after that first conversation, though Marcus only learned about them later. Anonymous messages sent through encrypted channels to Sophia's executive inbox, each one containing some fragment of internal company data that should not have been accessible from outside the building's systems, accompanied by short, cold sentences that stopped just short of explicit threat, phrased precisely enough to communicate danger while maintaining the appearance of plausibility. Someone was inside the system. Someone with enough access to move carefully and enough patience to escalate slowly. Sophia reported them to her head of cybersecurity, a careful man named Raymond, who had built a competent team but had not yet seen anything like what he was now looking at. The intrusion points were clean. Too clean. Whoever had done this knew how forensic IT teams worked and had taken deliberate steps to obscure the trail, not the work of a freelance hacker, but of someone who had resources and a plan, and had been building toward this for longer than anyone at Hart Technologies wanted to admit. The board of directors convened an emergency session. Sophia sat at the head of a table of 12 people and listened to men who had not built anything talk about protecting what she had built, and she kept her expression neutral and her voice measured, and she did not let them see how much the weight of it cost her. The Vantara deal could not be allowed to collapse. She had spent 18 months constructing it. It represented the single largest strategic move in the company's history, and the timing of the attacks announced at the same moment. The merger negotiations were entering. Their most delicate phase was not a coincidence. Someone wanted the deal to fall apart. Someone stood to gain significantly from a destabilized Hart Technologies, and that someone had the sophistication to move against a major corporation through multiple simultaneous vectors. Sophia knew what a coordinated campaign looked like. She had survived 2 hostile takeover attempts and a deliberate smear operation in the press after a competitor leaked a misleading earnings interpretation to a financial journalist. She recognized aggression with money behind it. This was something more. Marcus had been noticing for 6 days before he allowed himself to name what he was seeing. The sedan rotations he had logged and dismissed as a stretch, but the man in the gray jacket who appeared at the coffee cart across the street at the same 40-minute intervals across 3 separate nights, that was surveillance protocol. The way he positioned himself relative to the building's main entry, the patient, practiced stillness of someone who had been trained to wait. Marcus knew that posture with the intimacy of a man who had held it himself for hours, in places where moving meant dying. These were not criminals. They were professionals. And professionals, this patient and this disciplined, did not assemble outside a building without a specific objective. He began keeping his own log, handwritten, in a small notebook he kept in the back pocket of his work uniform, noting times and vehicle descriptions and the physical details of the men he observed. Old habits. He could not turn them off even when he wanted to. And standing in the cold air behind the building one night, watching a third rotation vehicle park with the engineered casualness of someone who had rehearsed it, he found that he did not particularly want to turn them off anymore. The night of the elevator was a Thursday. Sophia had a 6 o'clock meeting with 3 institutional investors, men who had large positions in Heart Technologies, and were beginning to ask questions that polite people asked when they were preparing to do something. Impolite, like pull their capital in the middle of a strategic transaction. The meeting ran long. Marcus was working the 38th floor when the elevator alarm registered from above, not the building's automated fire suppression alert, but the manual emergency button inside the cab, a sustained tone that indicated a trapped passenger. He took the stairwell. He reached the 41st floor and found the elevator doors 2 inches apart, held there by whatever had frozen the mechanism. And through the gap he could hear controlled breathing. Someone who was managing panic by concentrating on breathing, which was what people with training did, and also, occasionally, what people with extraordinary composure did when they had no training and simply refused to break. He already knew which this was before he spoke her name through the gap. The release mechanism for this model of elevator was in the adjacent utility corridor, behind a maintenance panel that required a bypass key he kept on his standard crew ring. He had read the building's technical specifications in his second week on the job, not because he expected to use them, but because a man who has run missions in unfamiliar environments develops the reflex of learning his terrain before he needs it. The mechanism took him 40 seconds. The doors opened. Sophia Hart stepped out, straightened her blazer, and looked at him with an expression that moved rapidly through several things. Relief, recognition, recalibration. Before settling into something more complicated, she said, "How did you know how to do that?" And Marcus said, "I read the manual when I started," which was entirely true, and also, he knew, entirely insufficient as an explanation, because reading a manual was not what made a man move through an emergency with that specific quality of stillness. She did not push it, but she looked at him differently from that moment, with the careful attentiveness of a person who has noticed something and filed it for later examination. What he found in the utility room afterward was not in the manual. A small device, no larger than a deck of cards, secured behind the main relay panel with a strong adhesive, a signal jammer modified for infrastructure interference, sophisticated enough to selectively disrupt elevator control systems without triggering the building's main security alerts. It was not the kind of thing available at an electronics store. It required specific knowledge and specific sourcing, and whoever had placed it had known exactly where to put it and how to make it look like a mechanical failure rather than an act. Marcus removed it carefully, using a cloth from his cart, and placed it in a sealed plastic liner bag. Then he finished his route and drove home, and sat at his kitchen table for a long time, looking at nothing before he picked up his phone and sent a message to a contact he had not reached out to in almost 3 years. The message was 4 words. The contact would understand. Sophia had her assistant pull personnel records the next morning. The file on Marcus Reed was notable for what it did not contain. Employment history prior to 4 years ago? Minimal. Education records? Incomplete. There were no professional references beyond a single line from a staffing agency, no social media presence, no digital footprint that a person accumulates simply by existing in the modern world. Either Marcus Reed had appeared from nowhere 4 years ago, or he had very deliberately removed himself from the evidence of a previous existence. Her assistant, a thorough young woman named Claire, presented both possibilities with equal diplomatic care. Sophia sat with it for the rest of the morning and did not come to a conclusion she was willing to put into words. What she had was an impression, and the impression was this: The man who worked her floor every night knew things that the circumstances of his current life did not explain, moved with a quality of controlled awareness that did not come from pushing carts, and had twice now appeared at the precise moment that something required competence rather than surprise. She was a woman who had built an empire on her ability to assess people quickly and accurately, and her assessment of Marcus Reed was that he was something she had not encountered before. The call came to Marcus at 1:47 in the morning, 2 days after the elevator. The number belonged to a man named Daniel Reeves, who had been Marcus's second-in-command through 4 deployments, and whose voice still carried the particular dry quality of someone who delivered serious information without dramatizing it, because he had learned that dramatizing serious information wasted the seconds you needed to respond to it. "You see the name Aldrich Voss lately?" Daniel said without preamble. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He had not heard that name in 6 years, but it landed in his chest the way the names of certain people always land, with the weight of specific memory, specific failure, specific cost. Aldrich Voss was a financier, a legitimate one, on paper. Behind the paper was a network of investment vehicles and intermediary entities that operated as an acquisition engine, identifying strategically valuable companies, destabilizing them through coordinated pressure campaigns, then absorbing them at crisis pricing. He had been doing it for years, across 3 continents, with the kind of patience that only men with deep capital and no moral constraints can sustain. Marcus had been part of a joint task force that came within 72 hours of rolling up Voss's operations 6 years ago, before an intelligence breach had scattered the network and let the man himself vanish into the architecture of financial anonymity he had spent a decade constructing. "I see it now," Marcus said. There was a silence on the line that carried its own weight. Then Daniel said, "Be careful, brother." Marcus already knew what careful meant. It meant he was done being invisible. Voss's strategy against Hart Technologies was a layered thing, the kind of operation that looked, from any single angle, like market forces at work. A financial news outlet published a speculative piece about the Vantara merger's structural risks, citing anonymous sources whose credibility was never verified but whose assertions were detailed enough to quote, "2 days later, a minor data breach at a Hart Technologies subsidiary was amplified in coverage far out of proportion to its actual scale. The company's stock price began to move, not catastrophically, but with the slow, deliberate pressure of a thumb on a scale. Institutional investors who had long positions began making inquiries. The board, already nervous from the email campaign, convened again, and this time the language was harder, and the patience around the table was shorter. Sophia held. She held because she had no choice, and because she was constitutionally incapable of not holding, and because some part of her that she had not yet examined fully was aware that there was something operating in her building at night that was paying attention to the same things she was paying attention to. She could not have said why that awareness steadied her. She did not try. Marcus began working on a different kind of overtime. After his cleaning shift ended, he spent 2 to 3 hours in his car or at a diner 2 blocks from the building, mapping the network he was beginning to reconstruct from fragments. The surveillance rotations outside the building corresponded to a schedule that implied a team of at least 6. The jammer in the utility room was consistent with hardware sourcing he recognized from a specific black market supplier in Eastern Europe. The same supplier that had appeared in the Voss network's logistics during the task force investigation 6 years prior. The financial pressure campaign, once he understood Voss's signature methodology, read like a playbook he had studied and annotated and argued about in briefing rooms with men who understood how financial violence worked in the spaces between laws. He was not operating as an agent. He had no authority, no agency backing, no legal standing beyond what any private citizen possessed. What he had was pattern recognition and the particular kind of patience that comes from having operated in environments where acting before you have the full picture is how people die. He gathered. He documented. He waited. The night Sophia found him in the parking structure, she had come down to her car at 11:30, later than usual, and he had been sitting in his car in the far corner with his notebook open and a street map of the surrounding blocks, printed and annotated in pencil. She knocked on the passenger window. He let her in. They sat in the dim light of a concrete structure, and she said, "I know you're not just a janitor." It was not an accusation. It was a woman who had assembled available evidence and arrived at the only conclusion the evidence supported, and who had the directness to name the conclusion rather than work around it. He said, "I'm not going to pretend the work isn't real." A pause. Then, "What are you, Marcus?" He looked at the notebook. Then he looked at her. "Someone who can see what's coming," he said, "and someone who knows the man behind it." She held his gaze without filling the silence, which was its own kind of intelligence. In the 6 weeks since he had handed her documents off a hallway floor, she had thought about the quality of his stillness many times, in the way that you think about something that does not fit the category you have placed it in. Sitting beside him in the quiet of the parking structure, she understood for the first time that the categories she had been using were simply too small. She did not feel frightened. She felt, with a certainty, she chose not to question in the moment, that she was sitting next to the right person. 2 days after that conversation, an article appeared in a financial technology publication with the byline of a journalist known for reliable sourcing. The piece contained a photograph pulled, Marcus assumed, from some archival database that had survived the scrub he had commissioned years ago, alongside a detailed account of his military service record. His name, his rank, his deployment history, his commendations, the broad outline of operations, whose specifics remained classified, and whose weight was visible even in the redacted version. Everything up to the point where the records went dark and the public biography went blank. By 9 in the morning, it had been circulated to every email thread inside Heart Technologies that could be reached by someone with internal access. By 9:30, the office was the particular kind of quiet that happens when a large group of people are all talking about the same thing in lowered voices. Marcus arrived for his shift that evening and walked through a lobby full of people who looked at him the way people look at someone they have reorganized their understanding of, with the specific combination of recalibration, mild embarrassment, that comes from having held a small opinion about someone who turns out to be considerably more than small. Bernadette said nothing and handed him a coffee, which was its own kind of eloquence. George looked at him with something close to awe, and then looked away when Marcus made eye contact, which Marcus understood was embarrassment at having laughed along with one of the younger men's jokes at Marcus's expense 2 months ago. The two young men said nothing at all, and found reasons to be in different sections of the building than usual. What the article's publication meant operationally was that Voss now knew Marcus was inside the building, which meant Voss knew the timeline had changed, which meant whatever was planned for the final phase of the operation would accelerate, because men like Voss did not tolerate unknowns in their architecture. Marcus had 3 days, at most, before the accelerated version arrived. He used all 3. The acceleration came 48 hours later. Marcus left the building at 3:15 in the morning and took his usual route to the parking structure on the next block, which was where it happened. There were 3 of them, which was a number that suggested someone had done a competent threat assessment of a single target moving on foot in a low-traffic area at an early hour. They came from 2 angles, one from behind a concrete column, 2 from the stairwell, and they moved with the coordinated timing of men who had rehearsed it. What they had not rehearsed for was a man who had been moving through hostile environments since his mid-20s and who had been anticipating this development for the past 36 hours. Marcus did not try to fight all 3 simultaneously. He moved rather than stood, which denied them the clean access points they had positioned for, and he used the parked vehicles and the concrete columns, the way he used whatever terrain was available, to create distance between himself and the coordinated attack, to isolate angles, to make one problem at a time out of what had been planned as a simultaneous one. It was not elegant. He took a hit to the ribs from a man with significant training who had gotten inside his reach for a moment, and he felt the bright, specific pain of it, and used the breath he took in response to think rather than react. He put that man down with a joint control technique that ended the encounter without permanent damage, because he needed information more than he needed a statement. The other 2 retreated when their coordinated advantage dissolved, which told him something about their mandate. They had been sent to scare or capture, not to kill. That was useful. The man he held on the cold concrete of the parking structure was professionally trained, mid-30s, with a specific tattoo on the inside of his left wrist that Marcus recognized from an intelligence briefing he had read 6 years ago. He was part of the same network. Marcus asked him 3 questions in a quiet, level voice that the man found more frightening than aggression would have been, and the man answered 2 of them. What Marcus learned was that the operation had moved to its final stage. There was an event, a major industry technology gala at a downtown hotel in 4 days that Sophia was scheduled to attend as a keynote speaker. The plan was to use the event to create an opportunity. They wanted Sophia to sign documents that would constitute a voluntary transfer of controlling interest in Heart Technologies, executed under conditions that would be characterized afterward as either coerced or the rational decision of a CEO who understood that she was out of options. He called Daniel from his car 10 minutes later and said 4 sentences. Daniel said, "On it." Marcus drove home, put ice on his ribs, and spent the next 3 hours outlining what he needed in the handwritten notebook that had become the physical record of the last 6 weeks of his unplanned return to the life he had tried to leave behind. The gala was held on a Friday evening at the Marquette Hotel, in a grand ballroom on the 2nd floor that held 600 people comfortably and was hosting slightly more than that. Sophia had been advised by her head of security to cancel her appearance. She declined, because canceling would signal exactly the kind of instability that the pressure campaign was designed to create, and because Sophia Hart did not communicate weakness when she had any available alternative. She attended in a midnight blue dress and spent the first hour of the event doing the precise professional work that her position required, speaking with investors, reassuring partners, demonstrating through her physical presence and conversational clarity that the CEO of Heart Technologies was entirely intact. Marcus was in the building before the first guests arrived, having been credentialed through a service entrance with a facilities pass that Daniel had arranged through channels Marcus did not ask about. He wore a plain dark suit, and he moved through the event the way he had moved through every complex environment he had ever entered, with a clear internal map, a priority list, and the habit of never occupying a position that did not give him a sightline to the thing he was protecting. The lights went at 8:47, which was when the dessert service was completing, and the room was in the comfortable, slightly loosened state that a ballroom enters when the formal agenda has concluded and people have had 2 drinks. The hotel's backup generator engaged 9 seconds later, which was 4 seconds longer than it should have taken. And in those 4 seconds, the ballroom was in complete darkness, and Marcus was already moving. He had identified Sophia's location in the room every 10 minutes since the event began. He reached her through the dark by the most direct available path, and spoke her name close and low, and she did not panic. She asked one question with the precise economy of someone who assesses before reacting, and he answered it in 3 words. "Stay with me." She did. He moved her through a service corridor and into a back stairwell, while the ballroom noise above them shifted from the surprised murmur of people who have briefly lost power to something with more edge in it. And then there was the sound of breaking glass, and he identified it as one of the ground floor access windows and understood that the incursion had begun. He had Sophia behind the catering storage room's locked door within 90 seconds. He made sure she had the emergency contact number Daniel had provided, and then he told her to open the door for no one who could not tell her the word he said next. And then he went back out. What followed in the next 22 minutes was a series of encounters that Marcus completed with the focused economy of a man who had long understood the difference between violence and precision. There were 5 men inside the building. 2 had come through the window access and were moving toward the stairwells. 2 more had entered through the service entrance, which meant someone on the hotel staff had been compromised, a detail Marcus had anticipated and prepared a contingency for. The 5th was Aldrich Voss himself, who had arrived in the building through the main entrance during the blackout and was moving toward the event coordinator's office on the 2nd floor, where a room had been reserved and a document package had been placed, waiting for a signature that Voss intended to extract from a woman he believed would have no options left once her protection was removed. Marcus was the protection Voss had not known was there. He was also the person who had spent the last 4 days placing what he needed in exactly the places he needed it. The confrontation with Voss was not a physical one, which was appropriate, because Voss was not a physical man. He was a man who engineered situations. He was standing in the event coordinator's office when Marcus came through the door, and for a long moment, the two men simply looked at each other across the width of a room that smelled of fresh carpet and hotel-issued air freshener, and Voss's expression completed a journey from confidence through recalibration to something that landed near comprehension. He said, "You're dead, professionally." Marcus said, "I know. I've been living with it." He placed a drive on the desk between them. A drive containing 6 weeks of documentation. The surveillance logs, the jammer device's sourcing chain, the financial transaction records that Daniel's contacts had surfaced, the testimony of the man from the parking structure, and 3 additional pieces of evidence that Marcus had gathered from sources he would not name and had not needed to explain because the evidence spoke for itself. "The federal agents outside know about the drive," Marcus said. "They've had a copy for 8 hours." Voss looked at the drive for a long moment, and Marcus watched the calculation happen in the man's face and watched it arrive at its only possible conclusion. Voss sat down. Federal agents entered the building 4 minutes later. The aftermath unfolded in the way that large, systemic things unfold, when they are forced into the light, slowly at first, and then with the rushing acceleration of water that has found its level. The network behind the campaign against Heart Technologies was larger than Marcus had estimated, and the federal investigation that followed the arrests at the Marquette Hotel took months and reached into 3 other corporations that had been in Voss's acquisition pipeline. The Vantera merger closed 6 weeks after the gala, behind schedule but intact, and the final transaction value exceeded original projections because Sophia had held the terms even under sustained pressure, and the market had eventually returned to fundamentals. She was on the cover of 2 business publications in the quarter that followed. She gave one interview about what had happened, and she was characteristically precise in her description. She had had good people around her. She did not elaborate. She did not name anyone. Those who knew, knew. Sophia requested a private meeting with Marcus 2 weeks after the arrests. He sat across from her in her office, on the 42nd floor, with the lake visible behind her and the late afternoon light, making everything look more deliberate than it probably was. And she looked at him the way she had looked at him in the parking structure, with the complete attention of a person who has stopped performing assessment and is simply present. She told him that the board had authorized a position for him, Chief of Strategic Security, with a title, a salary, and authority over the company's entire protection apparatus. She described it efficiently and without embellishment. He listened without expression. When she finished, he said, "I appreciate the thought." She said, "Is that a no?" He said, "It's a thank you." There was a pause that was comfortable rather than awkward, because they had spent enough time in silence together by then to know that silence between them was not a failure of communication, but simply one of its modes. Then she said, "What do you actually want, Marcus?" And he thought about it, really thought about it. The way he had not thought about what he wanted since before his discharge, since before the years of careful erasure, since before he had made himself invisible and told himself it was a choice rather than a wound. He said, "I want to keep doing something useful, without the uniform." She nodded once, slowly, and there was something in the nod that was not simply professional agreement. "I can work with that," she said. The arrangement they reached was quiet and practical, and suited them both. Marcus would serve as an independent security consultant to Heart Technologies, with specific responsibilities for threat assessment and operational protocols. He would work the hours that made sense to him. He would have an office if he wanted it, and a desk if he preferred that, and neither if he needed neither. He would not be required to explain himself to the board, or be introduced to visiting clients, or appear in the company's materials. He was not, it turned out, interested in visibility for its own sake. What he was interested in, what he had discovered over the 6 weeks of caring about something beyond his own careful diminishment, was the work itself, the purpose, the act of using what he carried, all that trained and tested and deeply costly knowledge, in service of something that deserved protecting. That he had not felt in years. He had missed it more than he had allowed himself to know. He was in the lobby on the first morning of his new role, standing not behind a cleaning cart, but simply standing, in the ordinary clothes of a man who has arrived to do work when the day crew began filing in. He watched people come through the doors in the comfortable distraction of morning, and he thought about all the floors he had walked in the dark, and all the nights he had pressed his forehead to the cold glass of the service corridor window and watched the city breathe below him, and all the mornings he had driven home, while the sun came up and sat at his kitchen table looking at a coffee cup without seeing it. He thought about his daughter, who was 17 now, and lived with her aunt in Atlanta, and called him every Sunday, and never asked why he was working as a janitor, because she knew, the way children of certain men always know, that the answer involves something larger than she was yet equipped to carry. He thought about what it would mean to be someone she could explain to her friends one day, without having to make her explanations carefully around the edges of a silence. Sophia found him in the lobby at 8:15, on her way to her first meeting, with coffee in one hand and her portfolio in the other, and the focused, forward energy that she always arrived with. She stopped when she saw him, and her expression did the thing it did now. Occasionally, when she allowed something unmanaged to surface a brief warmth, honest and unperformed, the kind that a woman of her discipline only permits when she has decided, at some level she may not have fully examined yet, that it is safe to permit. She said, "How's the first morning?" He considered it. "Quiet," he said. She said, "Good quiet or bad quiet?" He looked at the lobby, the morning light coming through the tall glass panels, the people moving through it with their coffees and their phones and their ordinary concerns, the floor still gleaming from the night crew's work, and he said, "Good quiet." She held his gaze for a moment longer than the conversation required, and then she was moving again, because she always had somewhere to be. But she glanced back once at the elevator bank and then at him, and she smiled. It was a small thing. It was not small. He left the building that evening with the departing crowd for the first time since he had started there. Not through the service exit. Not in the dark, after everyone else had gone. He came out through the main lobby doors with the 6 o'clock wave of people finishing their workday, and he stood for a moment on the sidewalk in the cooling October air, with the city moving around him in every direction. He had spent the better part of 2 years making himself invisible, and a large part of the years before that being visible in the specific and costly ways that military service makes a man visible to commanders, to enemies, to the particular darkness of operations that leave marks that are not listed on any official record. He had believed, for longer than he would have admitted, that the only safe space between those two states was the one he had constructed, the quiet apartment, the night shift, the systematic erasure of anything that could make him a person someone needed to consider. What the last 6 weeks had shown him was that this was not safety. It was a smaller version of the wound he was trying to heal, dressed up as its cure. Standing on the sidewalk outside Hart Technologies, watching the city do what cities do at 6 o'clock on a weekday evening, Marcus Reed allowed himself one deliberate thought about what came next. Not the job, which was already clear in his mind. Not the woman on the 42nd floor, whose presence in his thinking he was only beginning to let himself examine with the honesty it deserved. Just the next part, whatever it was. He had spent a long time in darkness, both the literal kind that came with his old life and the deliberate kind he had built around himself after it ended. And the remarkable thing, the thing he was only now beginning to understand, was that the darkness had not changed him into someone diminished. It had only hidden someone intact. He started walking. The city was loud and indifferent, and full of people who did not know his name or his history, or what he had spent the last few weeks surviving, and that was fine. He did not need them to know. What he needed, what he had been refusing to need, and was now, cautiously, and with the particular care of a man who has learned what it costs to be careless about important things, beginning to allow, was the smaller circle. The people who would know, the work that was real, the life that happened not in the dark, after everyone else had gone home, but in the ordinary, complicated, fully lit world that he had been watching through service corridor windows for too long. There is a version of the story that ends with the headline and the commendation and the public account of what happened at the Marquette Hotel. And that version is not wrong, it simply stops too early. The version that matters is the one that continues past the point where the cameras lose interest. It is the Sunday call with his daughter where, for the first time, he tells her a little more than he usually does. And here's the way her voice changes when she understands something new about who her father is. It is the Tuesday afternoon when he sits across a conference table from people who treat him as a peer rather than a service worker, and finds that he can hold that without flinching. It is the October evening, 6 weeks after the gala, when Sophia and Marcus walk out of the building together for the second time, and the conversation they have on the sidewalk is one that neither of them reports to anyone afterward, because some conversations belong entirely to the people having them. The value of a man is not in his title or his rank, or the decorations that governments give and then classify and then forget. It is not in the story that other people tell about him when they finally learn enough to be surprised. It is in what he does with his knowledge when the moment asks for it, and in whether, when the moment has passed and the crisis is over and the building is quiet again, he can find his way back to a life that is his own. Marcus Reed was 42 years old. He had been a ghost and a soldier and a man invisible by design. He was, for the first time in longer than he could comfortably remember, simply a man with somewhere to be. That was enough. That was, in fact, the whole point. There are things about a man that his service record cannot contain and that his silence cannot permanently conceal. Marcus Reed had spent 14 months in that building, telling himself the best version of his life was the invisible one, the one where nothing was asked of him, where no one depended on him in the ways that dependency had once cost him everything he thought he understood about the future. He had a daughter in Atlanta who knew pieces of him. He had a cell number that Daniel used once every several months. He had a studio apartment with a kitchen table and a lamp and a shelf of books he had read multiple times because reading familiar things in the dark hours before sleep was one of the few activities that did not demand anything from the primes. Version of himself, he was still learning to live inside. This was what he had told himself was enough. And sitting in the passenger seat of Sophia Hart's car one evening, 3 weeks after the arrests, while the city moved past the windows in its indifferent evening motion, and she was telling him something about the restructured security protocols the board had approved, and he was listening to her with only part of his attention, because the other part was occupied with the uncomplicated fact of being near her without an operational reason for it sitting there, he understood that he had been wrong about what enough meant. It had not been enough. It had been management. Competent, disciplined, sustainable management of a grief that he had not named correctly, because naming it correctly would have required admitting that what he was grieving was not the career or the clearances or the brotherhood of the teams, but the self that had existed before a specific operation on a specific night 6 years ago had shown him the limits of his control over outcomes he cared about. He had managed that grief by making himself a person with no outcomes to care about beyond the next shift's checklist. It had worked. In the way that removing a damaged limb works, the problem is addressed, and what replaces it is functional but different, and you spend years learning to walk again without showing anyone that the gait has changed. The 6 weeks with Heart Technologies had not given him back what he had lost. You do not get those things back. But they had given him something he had not anticipated. Evidence that the man who remained, after all the loss and all the years of deliberate diminishment, was someone with the capacity to matter to the people and things that deserved mattering to. That was not a small discovery. For Marcus Reed, at 42, standing on the sidewalk of a Chicago street, while the October air moved through the spaces between buildings and the city continued its vast indifference around him, that discovery was the beginning of everything that came next. He had always been good at beginnings in the operational sense. The insertion, the first movement into unfamiliar terrain, the disciplined focus of a man who has learned to silence the part of himself that asks what happens after. What he had never been particularly good at was the kind of beginning that does not come with a mission brief or a defined objective or a team who share the risk, the kind that is simply a door and a choice to walk through it, and the understanding that whatever is on the other side will require more of him than tactical competence. Those beginnings had always been harder. They remained harder. But on the evening he walked out of Hart Technologies through the main lobby doors for the second time in his life, Marcus Reed walked toward one of them with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has finally run out of reasons to walk in the other direction. Some stories are told in order to explain what happened. This one is told in order to ask something harder. What does it cost a man to erase himself? And what does it take to bring him back? Marcus Reed had answered the first question across 14 months of night shifts and careful silence. He was still learning the answer to the second, but he was learning it in the open now, in the way that people learn things when they have stopped protecting themselves from the knowledge fully, with the particular quality of attention he had spent decades applying to everything except his own life. The janitor, who was not a janitor. The soldier, who had tried to stop being a soldier. The man who had believed that invisibility was a form of peace, and who had discovered, in the most inconvenient way possible, that it was only ever a form of waiting. He had waited long enough. The city was loud and bright and entirely unconcerned with his revelation, and that was exactly right. The important things never require an audience. They only require the person they belong to, ready at last to receive them.